Hello and welcome. As you enter, please go ahead and read the message and enter your name, your role, and where you're located in the chat. And we're going to get started in a few minutes. Hi, everyone. Welcome. As you get settled, go ahead and read that message, add your name, your role, and where you're joining us from. And we'll get started in a few minutes. Happy holidays. That's a nice message. And welcome if you're just arriving, please read the message and add to the chat to tell us your name, what your role is, and where you're coming to us from. I see people are from all over the state so far, and a lot of different grades are represented. It's lovely to have you here. If you're just entering, please read the message and go ahead and put your name, your role at your school, and the location that you're coming from. We're just giving a few more minutes for people to trickle in. Sorry if you're hearing this for the 8th time, but for those who are just entering, please go ahead and read the message and tell us your name, what your position is at your school, and where you are. And go ahead to make connections with each other in the chat if you see something that piques your interest as well. 18 months to 5th grade. That's an interesting structure. I saw a few librarians here. Welcome. It's lovely to have you. Our attendee numbers are still going up, so we're going to give it a few more minutes. As you enter, read the message. Welcome to our first webinar of the series, and put your name, your location, and your role at your school in the chat. And go ahead and read where other people are from as well. It's fun to see everyone's coming from all over the place. We'll get started in about 2 more minutes. I see a few more people just entered. So hello, welcome. Please read the message and add your name, your role, and your location to the chat. We'll get started in 1 minute. Amanda, I'm in DC as well. Welcome. All right, we're just about ready. Thank you everyone for adding to the chat and sharing a little bit about yourselves. So let's go ahead and get started. So as you saw, we are in the first webinar of our Sustaining the Positive Momentum series. So this is the first of 4 that'll get you through this middle part of the year. So this webinar is called Teaching Self-Discipline, and we are going to discuss how to maintain a positive classroom environment and minimize off-task behaviors by promoting intrinsic motivation through teaching self-discipline. So I will be hosting tonight this webinar. My name is Alyssa Bruner. You may have just heard me say that I'm in Washington, D.C. I am a curriculum and instructional designer at the Center for Responsive Schools, and I focus on elementary school, which is where I spent my time teaching. I taught first grade, second grade, and fifth grade. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jane, who will tell us about herself and a little bit about the webinar features.
Thanks, Alyssa. Good evening or good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Hello, everyone. I'm Jane Kofi. I am the Director of Curriculum Instruction at the Center for Responsive Schools. I am here this evening to support Alyssa, and I'm going to be behind the scenes. So I want to tell you a little bit about what you're going to experience during this webinar so that everyone's in the same space when we think about just how this webinar format and how we typically do our webinar formats when we share information with educators all over the world. And so you'll probably notice, if you haven't already, that you can see us, but you can't see one another. And that is the way that this webinar is structured. You'll be able to hear and see everything that Alyssa has to share with you. And then if you are finding that you have a question, or if something resonates with you, then the features that you have available to you, the chat, which you've already been using to share where you're located, your role, and your name. But then also, if something resonates with you as you're spending time in this webinar this evening, you can put that in the chat box so that others are able to connect with you and also make some connections or get some ideas from things that you share in the chat. And then the question and answer feature is another feature that is available to you as well. This is a great place to put questions as they come to you during the webinar. It's really especially helpful because I'll be able to answer them, or if it's something that we feel is really going to be helpful for everyone to hear the response to, we'll make it available for everyone. With the question and answer feature, it's probably the best way to get your questions answered because sometimes things go through the chat and they get missed. But in the question and answer, they just stay right there. So you do have a question, put it in the Q&A box and I'll be able to respond in the back end, or if we need to, with the entire group. One of the questions that always comes up is, can I get this recording? And absolutely. So as soon as this webinar ends, you'll notice, if you didn't as you were entering, that it is being recorded. And so in the next few days, you'll get the recording, an email of it, but also the recording is also available on our website. So once it's aired and it's been posted there, you can get it there as well. And if you're having any issues in terms of just the connection, one of the things we found is if you've got a lot of windows open or a lot of browsers open, if you close those out, it helps in terms of the bandwidth that your computer is running on to be able to run the webinar at the same time. And if you get bumped out, that's okay. You can come right back in. You're welcome to just rejoin us wherever we are in the webinar. If you have questions, like I said, use the Q&A, things to resonate with, or connections you're making, use the chat feature. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Alyssa.
Thank you, Jane.
You're very welcome.
All right, so as always, we're going to start with our learning goals. These are our 3 learning goals we will be focusing on tonight. I'm going to read them. You can read them to yourself as well, and then take a minute and just choose which one you are going to spend your time focusing on. So the first one that we hope to give you knowledge about tonight is that you'll gain insight on the responsive classroom approach to discipline, which focuses on proactive behavior strategies. We're also going to learn how to promote student self-control and self-regulation in the classroom. And we will identify the difference between punishment and logical consequences. So go ahead and take a second, think about which of these 3 you're going to be focusing on today, or it might be all 3. That's okay too. So now that I gave you some time to independently reflect, I'm going to ask you to do some outward reflection. And go ahead and think about this question and share with the other participants in the chat. What skills do students need to be successful in the classroom? When you read this question, what comes in mind for you? Listening skills, definitely important. Routines, for sure. Focus, hands to self, independence. Oh, they're coming in so fast. I see a lot of them that are similar to one another, talking about engagement, self-regulation, communication and listening skills, executive functioning, social emotional skills, trust. Structure, engagement. Yeah, so just in a few moments, we generated a huge list of what skills students need to be successful in the classroom, right? And a lot of those are super important and vital for students. And a lot of the things that you're saying have to do with self-discipline. I saw some things about self-reflection or self-control, keeping hands to ourselves. A lot of what we want to do with the responsive classroom approach to discipline is to support students in their development of the skills that you're mentioning, some of which can be identified as self-discipline skills. So let's keep those skills that are important in mind as we continue through the self-discipline webinar. So we're going to start by talking about the goals of the responsive classroom discipline approach. So some of you may already be familiar with the responsive classroom discipline approach, and this might be brand new to you. But the goals of this approach are the same for both elementary school and middle school. And they are to ensure that students feel physically and emotionally safe in school so that they can learn at their best, and for them to develop self-discipline skills for working and learning cooperatively. So I'm actually going to, or Jane's actually going to send a link in the chat. This is an approach to discipline handout, and it is very valuable. It's a great resource for you to look at and use. I'm going to give you a second to look it over, and then I'm going to ask you to look at the second page with me, or if you don't want to pull it up on your screen, I'm going to tell you what I want you to know from it anyway, so that's okay. So go ahead and take a minute to just kind of flip through. Think about how you can use this in the future as well. There's a lot of great tips and tricks in here. And then we're going to look at that second page together a little more in depth. Did you see that there's a link in the chat? If you click that, it should bring you to a handout. And then the page that we're about to talk about is called The Approach to Discipline. And it's really just for you to follow along if you want to pull it up. And also so it helps you remember to look at this later because it's full of great tips and tricks. All right, it seems like mostly everyone else has had no issues getting this document up. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we're going to look at these components of the approach to discipline and just talk a little bit about the components that we consider part of the approach to discipline at Responsive Classroom. And the first is to create a safe and predictable learning environment. And this is to lay the foundation for a positive learning community. The second thing that we are going to focus on is preventing off-task behavior and misbehavior. And this is where self-discipline really comes into play. This is to help establish rules and hold students to those rules in a proactive, firm, fair, and consistent manner. We also are going to talk about how to respond to off-task behavior and misbehavior, and how we can get students back on track, repair any damage caused, and develop self-discipline to prevent similar problems in the future. Another component of the responsive classroom discipline approach is solving chronic behavior problems. And these are those kids that are having a really tough time and it's ongoing. And they're really going to need something that is individualized and really speaks to their specific needs. So these self-discipline skills are, of course, going to be helpful for any student that you have. But if you have a student that you have in mind who might need a little bit more support, you're going to do this and come up with an individualized plan for that student. And those are the outliers in your class. What we're talking about today will be for everyone. And then maybe some of those kids need some extra support. We'll also, another component of the discipline approach is managing outbursts. And this again talks about self-discipline and how we can get students to stop that in their tracks and how to regain self-control at that point of escalation so it doesn't get that far. So as I mentioned, you will now have this resource that you can look at on your own time. But I just wanted to take a moment and tell you a little bit about the responsive classroom discipline approach and give that resource to you so that you can look it over on your own time and then just tell you a little bit about those components. So now that we've talked about that, let's talk about what the differences are between punishments and logical consequences. And I'm sure some of you have heard about these already as well. So the responsive classroom approach to discipline uses logical consequences as opposed to punishments. And logical consequences are used to support students in learning self-regulation skills and to begin to learn socially responsible skills. And there are 3 R's that we refer to when we think about logical consequences. They are respectful, they are related, and they are realistic. And we're going to go a little bit more into what each of those R's refer to when thinking about logical consequences. So the first R is respectful. So when we're thinking of a logical consequence, the teacher's words and tone of voice must demonstrate respect. The focus of the teacher's words should also be on the behavior that has occurred rather than the child's character. So it's very important that the children feel a mutual sense of respect from the teacher. And that's especially important when dealing with a logical consequence, when dealing with discipline in general. So for example, when issuing a logical consequence to a student who has pushed a classmate, you might say, stop, hands off, our rules say to treat each other with respect. And you would say that rather than something like, stop being such a bully, right? So the first example, stop, hands off, our rules say to treat each other with respect. The tone is going to remain respectful. The words are going to be clear and concise, but you're also getting the point across that it needs to stop right now. The second one, stop being such a bully, takes the attention away from the action that the child is doing and talks about the character of the child. And that's really what we want to avoid. We don't want them to feel ashamed. Everyone makes mistakes. So we want to talk directly about the behavior that happened and not about any characteristics of that child. The second R in logical consequences is related. And this means that the consequence should be directly related to the children's actions. And I've got to be honest with you, this one's kind of the trickiest. And it's not always easy to come up with something that is directly related to what has happened. And if it's really difficult in that situation to do so, you want to make sure that you are still always being respectful and realistic and trying as best as you can to make something related to what happened. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what that might look like. So for example, if a group of children ask to work together on a project, and then they use that time to talk about their weekend plans, a related consequence would be that they lose the opportunity to work together that day or the next day. Another example would be on the playground. And if a student uses the slide incorrectly, they could lose the privilege of the slide for that day at recess, or maybe just for a specific period of time. And then they can try again and show you that they know how to use it correctly. The final R in relation to logical consequences is that it must be realistic. So the consequence must be something that the child can reasonably do and that the teacher can follow through with. I'm sure we all have memories of our parents when we were children saying, that's it, you're never using that again, right? It's not realistic. And the students know when you're making a threat like that, that it's not realistic and it won't be followed through. So in order for there to be a logical consequence, it has to be something that you can follow through with and that makes sense in that moment. So for example, a logical consequence for a child who writes on a desk is for the child to clean that desk. In contrast, asking the child to clean all the desks in the room would be a disproportionate response and would be very time consuming, both for the child to complete and the teacher to monitor. So as we're thinking of logical consequences, it's important for us to remember these 3 rules of logical consequences for us as educators are to be respectful, to have the consequence be related, and for it to be realistic. So now that we've talked about the characteristics of logical consequences, I'm going to tell you about the 3 types of logical consequences that we implement in the responsive classroom approach to discipline. The first one is called break it, fix it. And this is when you give the student the chance to remedy their mistake by fixing the damage that they have caused. So this might look like a student knocking over a tower that another student is building and having them pick it back up. But this also could talk about feelings. If they damage the relationship, then you want them to come up with a plan to fix it. The next type of logical consequence is a loss of privilege. So this would happen when a student is not meeting behavior expectations. They can lose that relevant privilege. And this goes back to what we were talking about in that playground example. Maybe they're not able to use the slide for the rest of recess that day. And the third type of logical consequence is positive timeout. So in elementary school, we might call that take a break. In middle school, we might call that space and time. But basically, this gives students an opportunity to regain self-control. It gives them the space and time that they need to take a step out, regain control, use whatever strategies they need to help make them feel like they're in a better place, and then they can try again. So in this section, we reviewed the responsive classroom approach to discipline and identified the differences between logical consequences and punishments. The responsive classroom approach to discipline protects the dignity of students and allows them the chance to correct their behavior and strengthen their self-control. And next, what we're going to do is take a deeper look at those specific practices and strategies that promote self-regulation and support self-discipline. So as we get started in this next section, I have another thinking question for you, and I would love to hear from you in the chat. So what are some strategies that you currently teach your students to help them handle big feelings or strong emotions? Breathing exercises, those are very important. Having a sip of water. Movement breaks. Having choice. Oh, the 5 senses, I like that activity as well. Drawing, yoga, taking a short break, sensory path. Journaling. A lot of people are saying these same ideas: water, taking a break, breathing, having these different meditative activities that students can go to. Positive self-talk, speaking to a trusted adult, Legos, yeah, or any high interest activity that they can focus on for a few minutes. Talking it out. These are all really great ideas, and it sounds like you're already doing some awesome things to help your students regain that self-control when they need it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about 2 things that can help you when you need to set that structure for them. So those are great practices to use. And now we're going to think about how we can set them up for success using a sense of order and predictability. Just going to read a few more of these as they come in, make sure we're not missing anything. Teaching them to talk about the emotion and giving them that language is really helpful. Sensory tools, zones of regulation, physical activity. Oh, I like that. Using the emotion to help them. For sure. These are great ideas. And teaching about what's going on in the brain. Great ideas. Thank you everyone for sharing so much. So as I said, we're going to talk about how we can proactively establish some clear classroom routines and procedures that can help students navigate their learning space so that they can take care of themselves, others, and their space. So these structures, when they're put into place, hopefully take away the time that is needed towards having these self-regulation strategies. But they also help with some predictability. They help the students know what the expectations are, and they help build self-discipline by really identifying what it looks like. So the first practice that you may or may not be familiar with is called interactive modeling. And interactive modeling is a simple and straightforward technique used for teaching specific skills, procedures, and routines, setting students up for success. It is used when you want to teach a specific skill, and when there is one desired behavioral outcome. And the steps of interactive modeling are a little bit different for elementary school than they are in middle school. In elementary school, they're a little bit more flushed out, and in middle school, you kind of make it a little bit more succinct, but it's essentially the same thing. So you think about a behavior that you want students to exhibit, for example, lining up at the end of a class period, and you model it for them. So you would say what you will model and why you're doing it. So I'm modeling lining up because we need to be safe and make transitions quickly so we can get to our next class period on time. Then you model the behavior, and after you model the behavior, you ask students what they noticed. Then you can invite one or more students to do that and ask the students what they noticed about those students doing it. And then you can have all the students practice while you as the teacher provide feedback. So there are many different ways that you can use interactive modeling, and they set clear guidance for expectations in any aspect that you want. So any part of the day that you want to set very clear guidance for expectations, you can use interactive modeling. So for example, showing students what different activities look like and sound like through interactive modeling. This can really help promote self-discipline by showing students exactly what the expectations are. It's easier for them to exemplify the desired behavior on their own. So instead of saying, be respectful, it's telling them exactly what that needs to look like and sound like in that specific moment. The interactive modeling can be used for many different behaviors from classroom procedures to social skills. So you can use it also. I think that this is really important for students to see is teachers can use interactive modeling to show themselves using self-regulation skills, such as calming down with deep breaths, as you were mentioning, or using positive timeout themselves when they're feeling upset or overwhelmed. So as a teacher, if you use interactive modeling to show, hey, I'm getting a little upset right now, and this is what I do when I take a break. What do you notice? And you take yourself to that calm down space, or you give yourself space and time. It can really show that anybody can benefit from this. It can remove any stigma that's related to it, and it can show those self-regulation tools used successfully in real time, which is really invaluable for students. Interactive modeling can also be used whenever students need to review a practice a skill or a routine. So of course, at this time of year, right, I think of winter break, and I'm sure that that's coming up for everyone. So when you return from winter break, in some ways, it feels like that first week of school all over again. So it might be helpful to take that time to go slow and remind students that this is what it looks like and sounds like to be in school. That interruption to the routine can really dysregulate students, and reminding them of what it looks like and sounds like can help them to reprogram their brains and to be more self-disciplined about what the expectations really are when they're reminded explicitly of what that should look like and sound like. So, oops, sorry. So there is a link that I'm going to have Jane send to you in the chat. This one is an interactive modeling planning guide, and you do not need to open it or look at it right now, but you can if you wish. So basically, as I mentioned earlier, there are two different versions of interactive modeling that you'll want to use if you're an elementary school educator or a middle school educator. But this planning guide hub on our classroom, on our Responsive Classroom website is a really great resource, and there are interactive modeling planning guides here. So you can think really intentionally about how you want to best support your students, to tell them exactly what to expect in different, or what the expectations are rather, in different settings. And so that you can help them to hone in on those self-discipline skills by knowing what the expectations are and what they should be doing in those exact moments. So you can definitely refer to those later. So you may have gotten a sneak peek when I went a slide ahead, but next we're going to talk about the importance of rules. And as I mentioned, I know that Jane just sent that in the chat, but hold on to that for later because we won't really have time for planning right now. But if you're eager to get started, I'm excited for you, but just hold on to that resource for later. So rules, as you probably are well aware, are a very important part of a classroom. And in Responsive Classroom, we suggest a collaborative rule creation process so that students are bought into the rules. And the rules are important because they are a proactive step toward discipline. They support an inclusive and safe learning environment, and they create a predictable environment that allows students to attain those hopes and dreams and learn to become more effective in following through with routines and procedures. So as I mentioned, in Responsive Classroom, we like to start the year off with a collaborative rule creation process using SMART goals and hopes and dreams, thinking about what we hope to accomplish and how that relates to the rules that are already existing in middle school, or how we can create those rules for our classroom community in elementary school. And it's important for us to not only create those rules, but to also refer to those rules often as the year continues to help promote self-discipline. So in order to be successful in following the rules, students need lots of encouragement, they need lots of support, and they need lots of practice without judgment or criticism. Referring to the rules frequently can help students to further understand behavior expectations and to understand how general expectations, like, for example, being respectful, translate into concrete behaviors. It can also help establish clear and specific expectations for different settings, such as at recess or meeting groups or working in partners. And referring to the rules can also help students become ethical thinkers through the internalization of classroom rules. And of course, when we're thinking about teaching self-discipline, we want to give students the chance to correct and learn from their own mistakes. So referring to the rules frequently will really help remind students of the expectations that emerge as a result of that collaborative rule creation process. And when they are reminded of the expectations, they are better able to self-monitor for success. So when a student is becoming dysregulated, reminding them of the classroom rules, referring to that rule before when they begin that behavior, that gives them the chance to fix it on their own before the teacher comes in and provides a solution for them. And this promotes self-discipline, and it allows students the opportunity to identify their misbehavior and fix it themselves. So the moment that something is happening, if we can remind them about it, maybe they can fix it on their own. And that is the goal that we are trying to embody. So for example, if a student is disrupting their peers, the teacher could say something like this: remember, rule 3, we are respectful of our learning environment. Think about how you can speak in a voice that would be respectful for those trying to learn around you. So the goal here is you say, remember, rule 3, we are respectful of our learning environment. And that student can take a moment and think, we've talked about what being respectful of our learning environment means. I bet I can make that switch myself. And then no further action is needed because they were able to take that on themselves and make that switch on their own. By referring to the rules purposefully, the teacher helps the students gradually assume more and more of that responsibility for their own actions, rather than being reliant on the teacher to make positive choices. So now that we've talked about what referring to the rules is and how it promotes self-discipline, I'm going to tell you how you can do it. So the first and most important thing to keep in mind is to use teacher language. And there are a bunch of different types of teacher language. And today we're going to zoom in on 3 different types. And the first is reinforcing language. So reinforcing language is used to reinforce the expectations that the students are doing already so that they can see what expected behavior looks like, sounds like, and feels like. So an example of this might be, we really followed our rule of being safe with our bodies by walking slowly in the hallway. That helped us be ready for recess in a calm and safe way. So you're pointing out what the students did. They're being safe with their bodies in the hallway. And that helped them to be ready for recess, which is something that they want. So reinforcing language tells them this is what you're doing and it's good. And it reinforces that behavior to keep it coming. You might also want to use reminding language, like we talked about a little bit before. Reminding language can help when those times get a little bit tricky. And it also can help proactively before you go somewhere that you know that it is going to be a tricky time for your students. And I couldn't agree more that the power of our words is super helpful, and this can all be found in there. So thank you, Jen. So reminding language helps students to remember the rules and then apply it to that context. So for example, if lunch is a particularly challenging time for your students, you can, or the transition to lunch is, you can say to them, we are about to get ready for lunch. Which of our rules is going to help us prepare for lunch in a safe and calm way? And you can have a quick discussion about that. And the third type of teacher language that can be helpful for promoting self-discipline is using redirecting language. And this happens when you want to quickly redirect students when they begin to veer off track in order to help them regain self-control. So you can say something very direct but respectful, like we talked about earlier. You'd say, stop, eyes on me. Our rules say we are safe with our bodies. We need to try that again. Remind me of what a safe body looks like. So you're reminding them of that rule. You're being firm and direct, but also respectful, and then giving them the chance to try it again. So using this teacher language helps support students when reminding them of the rules and pre-established routines throughout the day and expectations throughout the day. And it can help them build that internalized self-discipline around what the expectations are. The next thing that you can do is you can lead a structured discussion with the class or with an individual student as needed to help children apply general guidelines to specific situations. So something that comes to mind with this is before a field trip, you're going to really want to sit down and think, okay, these are our class rules. But when we leave this building, what does it look like in this new setting? What does it look like, sound like, and feel like in this new space? And how can we ensure that we are following the rules when we are there? On the contrary, if you have an individual student that is having a hard time transitioning somewhere, let's say they have a really hard time transitioning and focusing during art class, you can take them aside before class and walk through the rules, asking them to discuss with you what it would look like, sound like, and feel like to follow the rules in the hallway leading up to the class and in that new space. And having the moment to process, okay, this is what it would look like, sound like, and feel like to follow these rules in those spaces can really help them to internalize the skills that they need to promote that self-discipline and to stay on track. Another really helpful way to refer to the rules is by using interactive modeling again and role play to help students prepare for situations, reminding them of the rules and asking them to show how they can follow them in those situations. So, for example, if you're asking your students to get into groups and do peer editing on one another's work, you would definitely want to use something like interactive modeling to show how that conversation could go and how to provide clear, concise, constructive feedback while adhering to the classroom rules, setting them up for success from the beginning. Or another example is before recess, you could use role play to go through a few common scenarios, such as a student wanting to join in on a game when it's already happening. Working through the scenario and reminding students of how to respond in a way that adheres to the rules will set them up for success if and when those scenarios arise. And then again, since we're talking about sustaining the positive momentum and thinking about this tricky time of the school year, another thing that you can do is you can revisit those hopes and dreams or SMART goals. And this is something that makes sense to do halfway through the school year, perhaps when returning from winter break. people's dreams and hopes and goals, and they change as time goes on. So you may want to revisit them and adjust the rules as you need to. And for this, you want to revisit what you did in the beginning of the year and that same toolbox that you use to discuss what each rule will look like and sound like. Maybe use role play for different scenarios and work through different ways to handle it while keeping those rules in mind. So if you want to read more about rules talk and how to refer to the rules and how that can promote self-discipline, we do have a link that Jane just sent in the chat that talks a lot more about it. So in this section, we discuss practices and strategies that help support students in their journey towards self-discipline. When you provide students with structures and strategies such as this, they're more likely to be successful. It's that simple. The more that you talk about it, the more that you give them explicit ways to follow those expectations, the better, and the more likely they are to be successful in school. So next, we are almost done. We are going to wrap up by reflecting on our learning from the day, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some additional resources for this topic. So I would love to hear from you once more. What is one key insight or takeaway that you personally have gained from tonight's webinar? Please go ahead and share that with us in the chat box. Stay neutral in your voice and tone. Yeah, that's really important, especially when something might be escalating. Interactive modeling, neutral tone, the ways to refer to the rules, focusing on the behavior, not the characteristics. Teacher language, language is so important. Setting up structure and expectations prior to an activity. Revisiting those hopes and dreams. Different types of teacher language. Realistic consequences, logical consequences, yep. It's awesome to see that people are picking and choosing different things from different parts of tonight's webinar. I hope that everyone is going away with some really helpful tidbits to help support the amazing teaching that you're already doing. Intrinsic motivation. Yeah, I think that this time of year is really a good time to revisit those hopes and dreams after the break. Interactive modeling, have them take agency in those rules. Yep. Positive teacher language. Thank you all so much for sharing. Relevant consequences. Related consequences, yeah, reinforcing language, not always just reminding. That is important. As adults too, it's easier when somebody reinforces our positive behaviors than when they remind us of our negative ones, right? So keeping that in mind and helping students to see the positive that they're already doing, it's really impactful, it's really powerful. All right, so we can begin to close out now. Thank you all for sharing so much. So here are 3 books, and we are not limited to these 3. As somebody mentioned, The Power of Our Words is super helpful as well. But these books talk about self-discipline, as the first one is titled Teaching Self-Discipline. There's also Seeing the Good in Students, which is specifically about discipline in middle school, and then Responsive School Discipline, which is for elementary school leaders. I also wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit more about the upcoming webinars in our series. So as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar tonight, this is the first webinar in our 4-part series titled Sustaining the Positive Momentum. The next webinar will take place in almost exactly a month. I will be hosting that with my colleague who is a middle school educator. It'll be about addressing challenging behaviors with morning meeting and with responsive advisory meetings. So we hope to see you there. Then in February, we'll have a webinar on teacher language for engaged learning. And in March, we will have a webinar on problem solving with students. If you have any questions, or if you would like to find information out about how to bring responsive classroom to your school, you can contact our Educational Partnership Department at the email that is listed here. And you can also feel free to reach out to me. This is my email here. If you have any questions about self-discipline or responsive classroom in general, I'm happy to chat with you. I'm happy to help you think through some tricky situations. And yeah, so please feel free to take this information down if that would be helpful for you.
Thanks, Alyssa. We had a question, and I want to be able to answer that question. It was a question specifically about rewards and how that works when you're supporting students with managing themselves, because that's what we want to ideally do. We want students to be successful in building those internal controls so that they're able to manage themselves and choose those socially responsible behaviors. And so when it comes to things as rewards, something to keep in mind, and I'm actually going to put an article in the chat that may be helpful for people who are thinking about trying to navigate where and if rewards fit in. And in the responsive classroom approach, we don't use rewards. And if you think about it this way, when we give students something tangible, and because we want to help support students in building those intrinsic motivators on their own, but also in learning to regulate themselves, they have to learn that isn't something that students just automatically come already knowing how to manage their own behaviors and self-control, which is tricky at any age for any student, even for some adults. So when we give a student something tangible in order for them to follow an expectation, for example, what that then does is put the control of being able to regulate oneself on the adult. So that child is not learning to regulate their own behaviors or themselves. They are expecting or relying on the adult to do that for them because they're receiving something in order for that to happen. And so if we think about the ways that we want to be able to support students in being able to develop internal controls, we want to do them in a way that allows students to start to know and feel many of the things that people put in the chat, like I do breathing, or I help students with this technique or a walk around. We're teaching them the different types of ways to kind of monitor and support themselves when they're feeling a little bit out of control. It's the same thing as we do as adults. If we're feeling out of control, we have maybe things that we always are go-tos, and we have some things that we try out every now and then, and some additional things that help us support ourselves when something is challenging or difficult. We're teaching students, just like we do when we teach students to read, or when we teach students a math strategy, we're teaching them a skill that they can then kind of internalize and therefore be able to use them in a way that's going to work best in various situations as students get older. And so having students rely on something that they're always going to get in order for them to exhibit a specific expectation takes that control away from the student and puts it on the adult. So they're not learning to control themselves. The adult is controlling them. So that's one, that's a response to the question about rewards and the use of rewards in responsive classroom. I think that was one of the questions, and I just saw another one come in.
Yeah, so this one, and we can both speak to this. What are some relevant consequences for physical behaviors, like pushing?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so when it comes to physical behaviors, I think there are several things to keep in mind when it comes to physical contact between students. In some districts, in some schools, there are certain mandates for if a child does this, this is the consequence that results from this particular behavior. When it comes to logical consequences, one of the things that Alyssa pointed out is you are stopping or you're getting to the behavior before it escalates. When it gets to the point where it's something of like a physical altercation, it's beyond that point where you're trying to help students get back down to the place where they're able to reasonably think through things. Someone put in the chat something about teaching children about the brain. And that's so helpful because once they're at the place where they're functioning from their brainstem, they are no longer able to hear and process things in a very logical way to be able to say, oh, wait, I should probably not do that. Let me try this. When it comes to a physical behavior that's more of a like an accidental behavior, like maybe even a gentle response to something, then there are consequences that we can give students that make sense for the behavior that's still related, that's still respectful, and is still relevant to what they're seeing happening. One of the things that Alyssa pointed out is you're not always going to find a perfect match for every single behavior that you see. The first and most important thing is that you stop the behavior and help the student see that this is not the expectation in this space or in this particular situation. And then you're teaching them, okay, so this is what happened. Here is what we need to think about, and here's what we need to do for the next time. And that's the most important thing that you're trying to teach students, rather than I need to pair this behavior with this response every single time. Alyssa, I didn't know if you feel like you were going to say something, and I just like jumped in.
No, that was perfect. Thank you. I was just looking to see the other questions, but it looks like we've answered them all.
Oh, the 3 books. The 3 books.
Oh yeah, I messaged them in the chat, but if anybody else was looking for them, here they are again. Oh, 2 back. There we go. If anybody else wanted these book titles again, here they are. And thank you all so much for giving your Thursday evening, afternoon, morning, whatever it is for you. Thank you for giving us your time today. We really appreciate it. And we appreciate the work that you do as educators to help support students in the classroom. So thank you so much for coming, and we hope you have a fantastic evening.